Hi, welcome to another episode of the Near Future podcast with Tom and Jonny. We've got a lot on the docket this week, so we're going to get straight into it. First of all, Tom, you ran another mostly working event with Kate Pincot from Multiverse. Wonder if you want to tell us a little bit about that up front.
Yeah, it was super fun. Ran that last week from the Gradient Labs office in London, and we had a great crowd. Thanks to anyone who's listening to this who came along. Kate was a great speaker. Gave some really interesting insights into how Multiverse are thinking about the opportunity for brand design to scale their approach and impact through tooling and agents to scale how their brand is applied. It was very cool.
Nice.
I've also just got to call out at the start, Jonny, that you the last time we recorded there was a reversing truck, and this time it sounds like there's a chainsaw in the background or a power saw, angle grinder. I think it really enhances that ambiance though. So,
makes it feel real, you know. This is the real world. We don't exist in a vacuum. We're not AI from space.
Yes, at least not yet.
We're not Synthesia models and 11 Labs voices.
Yes. Although I wonder if there's an 11 Labs reversing truck that we can add on to our podcast at some point in the future.
Yeah.
Anyway, mostly working last week was great with Kate. It was really fascinating to hear the approach there, and just great to host it in a new space and be surrounded by great people. The other thing to just share up front is that we're gearing up to welcome our first podcast guest next week. Well, we will be recording with our first guest next week, and we have guests lined up throughout July. So really excited for this next chapter of exploring with this podcast. So if you're listening to this and have any feedback that would help us not make a fool of ourselves when we invite real important people on to speak with us, please let us know.
Awesome. I also have a bit of news up front, Tom, which is that I'm standing up. So, you know, I ran one podcast in a prior life, in a prior company, and podcasts then you could just do audio and you could be lounging around or staring into space or picking your nose and it would be absolutely fine. And now you have to do video, and I feel like I'm getting found out here. I edited the last episode and I was like, what are you doing with yourself? So my focus is now on standing still, looking at the camera, and so if anyone's listening to this and not watching it, I mean, it was still not going to be great, so I wouldn't tune in quite yet. But maybe in a year's time, I'll be good at this. But yeah, the sunglasses last week was an interesting option. I feel like this week maybe a little bit better, but we'll see. I just wanted to ask you before we go into the main bulk of the podcast. You just mentioned mostly working. But you've had some reflections on mostly working as a format. Running a meetup is hard. Working out how to make it work in person and remote. Just for those people that may have been to mostly working, which maybe some of our listeners at the moment, what you're learning so far, I think is kind of interesting for those people thinking about, I'd love to run a meetup or an event.
Yeah, of course. So we've done 5 now, and they've been roughly every month since January. I think the meta reflection is that when we started in January, the state of the world was that people were aware of AI but hadn't really spent a ton of time building with these tools. And 6 months later, that is very different. Most people have been trying, exploring, playing with these things a little bit. There's still a gap between playing with something and actually getting real value from it. But the need to have a dedicated space to get hands-on and build things seems to have evolved from just trying something through to actually doing something useful with it, which I think is as an interesting reflection of where we are with AI right now. And I think
seamless transition.
Yes,
that was so seamless.
It would be if I carried on, but there's another thing I wanted to mention, which is that I think that so when we started running these events, it was a really wide spread of what people were interested in hearing about, from like opening the terminal for the first time and starting to use Claude Code for the first time. And we had various designers coming through who did open Claude Code for the first time, or Cursor, or whatever the tool was, in those sessions. Yeah. And then they came back a month later and said, wow, I got so far, I built so much stuff, I have this product that I've shared with my internal team, and they're all using it and working off of it now. Or I'm starting to speak with VCs about raising money for this tool that I've like literally built for the first time a month ago. So it's very inspiring to hear that. But I think the level of conversation has shifted at this point towards designers generally being a bit more curious about actual applied ways of working inside companies at scale. So less one-off experiments or people starting from scratch in their own design system constraint legacy product free world, through to how do we actually make this work inside our team of 5 or 10 or 20 or 100. And I think there's a level of nuance there that means that some ways companies are approaching this are very unique to how that company operates. And then if your team is 5 people, it might be a bit different because of the scale and size and the kind of challenges you need to tackle. But really interesting to get a glimpse into like how real people are working with these tools in real settings, not just the sort of sandboxed, I'm going to prototype something on my own version of that.
Right. I think that we are past the like cool demo in my bedroom, local host. Isn't this like an interesting technology and let's see how far it can go stage? And companies are looking at their token costs, but also teams are saying, well, all of this promise, what's it turning into? Is it turning into actual value? And so now this is good though, because we've moved out of this existential fear and, oh my God, maybe it can do everything. Maybe we're cooked, to this is a tool. We can't work out how to use it well together yet. So let's do that. And I think, I mean, I wasn't at this latest mostly working, but the conversation then matures into like, practically, how do we shape this into something that I can take back to my team and everyone will be like, great, this is genuinely useful, rather than that's a cool side project. Let's get back to drawing rectangles or whatever it is.
Exactly. So with that perfect transition, let's talk about Config, Figma Config, because that happened at the end of last week. And Figma, a tool historically known for being great at drawing rectangles, now exploring a bunch of new things. They released a bunch of new features, from motion to the code layer to various other smorgasbord of functionality that they're hinting at and releasing. An interesting set of things for us to be exploring. Jonny and I weren't there in person, so we can't speak to the sort of what the vibe was like in the room, but we've had some thoughts and reflections following it. So Jonny, do you want to kick us off with a conversation around config and what's next for Figma and the tooling space?
Yeah, hot takes from across the Atlantic coming your way. So people who've read my blog in the past and seen what I've been writing could take me as a Figma hater. That is not true, although I've always felt that Figma and the tools that predate Figma, Sketch, and I mean, I drew my first UI in Photoshop probably, but they're a bad facsimile of the real thing. And at best, they can achieve a percentage, not much more than 50% of the fidelity of something that is actually built in the technology that it will end up being in, whether that's in Swift or whether that's in the web or whatever it is. And I have also personally found, as a designer that has coded for a long time, that the sort of rote work involved in drawing rectangles, and Figma have now released slots, which for people that are in this world will know what that means, but a big time saver. But it's amazing that it took them so long to do that. That feels like the actual biggest release of the year in many ways. But it's like really time consuming to get to something that in code you could get to very quickly, even before AI, because I could have like a blob of data and just repeat that data to create a table and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so I'm not a Figma hater. It's come from a place that made complete sense, I think, up until coding models appeared. And they are very bound to their architecture and their way of working and the workflows that they have been selling for many years. And I think that what you see in the features they're releasing now is effectively trying to protect the golden goose, which is what they currently have, while also reaching into some of the other aspects of the design process that they haven't been able to service well up until this point. So they've sort of gone in both directions. On one side, which is the more like creative, like image making, and like, you know, what could this be, and that like earliest stage of the design process, they've built Motion, which is their sort of After Effects Lottie type tool for motion stuff, and they bought a company Weave, which they've turned into Figma Weave, which is like asset generation with AI. Both interesting things and feel like a good fit probably if you think of Figma as the tool where you start doing your work and imagine what it could look like. And then they built in the other direction fairly consistently. They built Figma Sites and Figma Make, which was their sort of vibe coding thing. That was last year, and now they have built these code components within Figma where you can drop code blocks into your Figma canvas. And haven't tried it because it's not available yet, so we can only go by what they've announced. But it does slightly feel like forcing code into the canvas, which still feels like the wrong way around. Like, you know, if the source of truth is code, why am I putting the source of truth into something that isn't the source of truth just to push it back again? It feels like, of course, that's how Figma should do it because they need to keep people in their canvas. But it doesn't feel like if you were to design something from scratch, that's how you'd do it today. So that's a long way of saying it feels like a bit of a mess and a bit of like grabbing all the sort of bits of the design process that they haven't touched yet and trying to sort of do a bit of an Adobe on it and scoop up all of those existing enterprise contracts and make sure that they don't wander off because they have something good enough in the existing relationship they have with Figma. I don't know if that sounds really negative, but I think the one thing I did come out with was none of this feels like the thing that solidifies Figma's place in the design universe. Like, it's good for people that want to stick to Figma. I think a lot of these features will be underbaked for a while yet. So if you want best in class at, for example, designing in code, you probably wouldn't use Figma for that. If you want to design in code a bit while you mainly stay in your canvas, it makes sense to have to use Figma. But as they start to move into these things that they're historically less good at and less geared up to be good at, I think it weakens their position generally in the market, would be my bet. And I'm talking my book because I wrote an article in February about this, and I still believe it to be true that the source of truth is the ultimate question. Like, where does this all ladder up to or down to? Where are the core components, quite literally or figuratively, of the design process? Where do they live, and where's the truth that sits underneath all of those, whether that's a design system or the actual code base or things like that? And that probably points the direction to where the future is, I posit. And what that means, I think, for a lot of other tools that have sprung up, and I've built a website to capture a big list of them, designtools.fyi, I'll plug it again. But I think a lot of those tools will look at this and say, we probably expected Figma to do this. And some of those have made a bet, which is one part of what Figma's now shipped, and probably they'd be worried. But those tools that are sort of building on code as source of truth, I think, can feel like this doesn't invalidate what we're doing. This is what Figma should be doing for them, but we can do something different. And there'll be enough people in the world that will want that we can feel confident in it. So mainly, choice is still alive. You can still use Figma, and that's great. And for a lot of teams, that's the right move right now. But it doesn't remove any of the other exciting, often open source or really interesting projects that are happening to explore new ways of designing and more sort of modern ways of designing as well. So I talked for a little while, but there we go. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, just to play back some of the sort of themes I'm hearing from you, the design process is, I think for a while, Figma has owned the entire design process as a function, as a discipline, and that process is starting to be pulled in two different directions. There is the upstream exploratory creative asset generation, things that would inform a source of truth but aren't necessarily the source of truth. They're more the playground for experimentation and exploration. And then there is this other end of the process, which is implementation, execution, like how do we get this into people's real hands? And yeah, Figma are pushing both directions simultaneously. But that second one, I think the first one there, they are well suited to, but I think that's a smaller piece of the overall design puzzle. I think that handoff question, I think, is really the really juicy, interesting one. And I think they're coming at it from this sort of canvas first into code versus all these other tools that are code first into the canvas. I feel like some version of a canvas will need to exist, but I think the sort of ownership of that is less clear than it historically was. For me, I think there's also these extra aspects of, as we enter this era of codifying strong design judgment into a design system or whatever the code base is for the source of truth. I think that's moving away from just components and sort of UI elements into how do we make judgment decisions about what our bar for quality is, things that are more about design.md or other ways of shaping and defining our bar for what craft is and embedding that into the way we ship products or the way we make design decisions. And so I'm kind of curious what form that's going to take, because it doesn't feel like it naturally lives on a canvas in the same way that sort of execution level design has, but there is some amount of workflow logic in what is our bar, how do we hold everyone to it, and not just for designers. Maybe designers are the people who are best placed to help define and set that bar, but I could imagine that being used by engineers or PMs who are making changes to the design of the experience they're responsible for without collaborating directly with the designer. But there needs to be some sort of structural, opinionated position on where is our bar for quality and our bar for craft, and how do we scale that more broadly across the organization without individual designers being a bottleneck. Unless those individual designers these are really important features for an individual designer to be pushing against and really handcrafting. That's a different story. But at an organization level, that probably isn't going to be true 100% of the time, always, forever. So anyway, that's sort of my broad perspective, and some of that is what you've already said, but just playing it back. But I think it does mean, if we're thinking about our design tools, is this about execution and implementation, or is this about ideation? I think that really sort of focuses what the purpose of that tool is and how we use it. And I think for anyone who's brand new to design, perhaps who's listening to this podcast for the first time, or as a PM listening to this, I think throughout my career, I have found that it's not always super obvious that there are these two versions of design. And I think AI has kind of collapsed those now, where you can prompt an AI to like a Lovable or a Claude.design into creating UI that looks convincingly polished. And there's a separate conversation about whether that's good or not. But I think it does, further exacerbate the challenge of having these two very different forms of design output converging into, I'm going to make an assumption of how good or bad this design is when I'm 5 minutes into the design process versus 5 days, which I think is an interesting challenge to overcome. And throughout design history, there's been the quality of the artifact determines the kind of feedback you're going to get on it and how to shape and evolve it. We don't need to go down that path right now, but I think it is this sort of interesting, the illusion of like getting to a final artifact and then having to back out of it to like really interrogate those decisions and work forward is this interesting, sort of feels like a shortcut, but actually is in many ways much longer process that just seems to start from this weird position, which is fine if you're using it for ideation and testing prototypes and ideas really quickly. But if you're trying to get something into production sooner, it's sort of a different way to think about that. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Cool.
Anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, I think I suppose there's a bit of a callback to a conversation we had a couple of episodes ago about sovereign AI also, which is, Figma is a US-based company that you can imagine a world in which there's some sort of hostile or otherwise takeover by a trillionaire unnamed trillionaire or someone, and then sure, the design process is maybe less of a state issue than access to models. But just having choice into how you do things and having a solid alternative. I think Affinity going free and really shaking up Adobe was just fascinating. And, Canva, Australian founders and less US beholden. So and that's, very much in the design world as well. Just seeing different models, different places you can go for your design work and things like that. It's just exciting. So let's move on from config. We've done enough Figma bashing, and it's not bashing. It's a healthy critique, I would say.
Can I actually add one more thing? I don't know if I was clear when I was talking about this, but the source of truth aspect of this, and I've spoken with a few startups recently who talk about using AI to prototype really quickly, but then once they have got some clarity on the direction they're going in and got some feedback from customers, then they will design it up in Figma from that prototype. And so Figma has remained that source of truth. So I think the source of truth question will be ultimately the decider of these big enterprises that have invested lots of time and money and workflows into making Figma the source of truth. I think that's going to be a big thing to change into code. And if it does change into code, I think it's going to be really hard to change back. So for me, that feels like the biggest factor in what's going to influence where that source of truth lives. And there's
definitely a design equivalent to like unscrew up my vibe coded app, which is like unscrew up my sloppy design. And there is, for a while, Figma, you've been able to import like a snapshot of HTML in, and it converts it to Figma layers, and then you can fool around with it and like make it look better. As you say, how long does that last? That could be Figma, or it could be somewhere else. It could be an open source, like Pencil or some open source tool that just builds a good enough canvas that actually makes sense to do it there, and it stays in HTML. So it's more, you're actually changing the code rather than changing an object that looks like the code. So really interesting. I think these canvases and the rectangles plays a role. Like, it really does. It doesn't go away. And I think you've been saying that as well. It's just whether it is an ancillary tool versus whether it is at the center of the workflow. And I think that is the more subtle change. Nothing dies overnight, but that is the more subtle change that may come about. Right, let's move on.
Yes. So Jonny, you wrote, I'm going to interrupt you there, but let's move on, obviously. You wrote some thoughts down about the Jagged frontier and how craft sits within that, and some lessons and takeaways, reflections over our work in the space over the last year. So we'd love to hear any thoughts you want to share on that, maybe for someone who hasn't read your piece.
Yeah, I finally broke ground on our nearfuture.works blog. So far, the blog or the update section was just the podcast, and so now there is an actual written article on the blog as well. So I mainly wanted to do that, but I also wanted to encapsulate something that we've been thinking about a lot as we've been putting together creds decks and positioning ourselves against various other outfits that do outwardly similar things to us. And I think one thing that we've really learned over the last year is that good transformation of a process, whether it's a whole organization or whether it's within one team, from non-AI driven to AI driven, is not as easy as you think it's going to be. It's not a case of someone sitting in the corner and like bashing out a new way of doing it, and then everyone's like, cool, that works. It's just change management. And my last company was in HR tech. I saw how complex it was to change process from the inside. And we ended up having to spend a lot of time with customers in 3-month rollout plans, doing tours of thousands of employees to make sure everyone understood what this tool did, even the simplest version of it. So change is always hard when you think about a lot of people changing at the same time. And so I wanted to try and get it into 3 points, because 3 is the magic number, and that's what trips off the tongue. So 3 things to really think about when you're like, I want to change my organization to be AI first, and I want this transition to be successful and not just something that we're tick boxing for the board or some other reason that isn't the best reason to do it. I want in a year's time for us to be industry leading in our category, and I think AI is the way that we can do it. And but I want it to go well, and I don't want it to break our culture, and I don't want people to leave because I'm pushing AI down their throats. And I want it to result in actually materially good outcomes that I can point at and I can graph, rather than like good vibes and everyone's spending loads of tokens. So I tried to capture that. I captured it quite quickly, and I think that this is a first version. I'm sure we will iterate over this, and I think it captures both of our thoughts, but I wrote it and we haven't had a lot of chance to talk about it. But so the three things are a coherent strategy I've written, which is basically like we get together and decide why we're doing this, which is sort of what I've just been describing. What is the impact we want to have? Why? How much money do we want to spend on it? How much do we want to break the culture to do it? AKA, how fast do we want to move? All of those things should be made centrally and then sort of commsed out in the right way. Maybe this is a little bit more like CEO stuff rather than in the weeds for a designer. And then the second one is hearts and minds, what we call hearts and minds, which is really just, it can't just be one person vibe coding and pushing it out. It has to be buy-in from everyone, from like IT and procurement who need to buy a tool or like give you access to a model and decide where the data lives and all of that kind of boring but important stuff. It needs to be the people that are deciding the work you're doing so that they can say, don't worry, do a little bit less of that work so you can spend time here. So just like getting buy-in and support from your boss and the exec. And then everyone who's actually going to work on it, really just making sure that they understand and are excited about the outcome that they're trying to get to. And it is a team sport. This is a team sport. You can't exact change on your own. That's the second one. The third one is the one that I think is kind of where we have the strongest opinions. And I also think where people miss out, like the first two, fairly obvious, have a strategy and then make sure everyone's bought in. Well, duh. But the third one is not assuming that the things you build are just automatically going to be better just because it's AI and AI is magic and it seems to happen very fast and you built a cool demo. I think where we've seen issues happen is everyone's very excited by the first version. You show the stakeholders, they're like, wow, can I have this yesterday? Let's just turn it on. And everyone gets excited about it. And what a win to get something done so quickly as well. Like, you've done this in 24 hours, all of that kind of stuff. And you get so swept up in it that you forget to check whether the output is any good. And this comes back to craft. So the craft is ultimately still the human's responsibility. I can't blame my tools if something goes wrong. And so even though it's been way more efficient than if a human did it, if it's even 5% worse, then that is a bad outcome. It needs to, the bar cannot drop. And especially if what you're turning on does 10 times the amount of work as a human, things go wrong 10 times faster. And that sort of descent into slop, if you like, starts to happen really quickly. So that was what I was trying to capture in the blog post, which I will put in the show notes for sure. But I think it's just like a vote for craft and a vote for slowing down a little bit at the right time. People talk about this barbell strategy around AI generally, which is where you decide what you need up front and you spend more time there. And I think that's basically what you were just talking about, Tom, is like you take the time to decide what good looks like. Maybe it's an art direction or maybe it's just like a company direction. And then you spend more time at the end. And the middle is the bulk of the execution that happens quite quickly. But then at the end is like more QA, more time spent looking at it, evals, all of that kind of stuff. So it's very tempting to just turn on 50 agents and, fire your team or whatever a certain group of leaders would want to do. And I think we've seen the negative side of that. And so I wanted to sort of write that as a piece to be able to share with maybe potential clients and just to sort of establish our opinion against the rest of the world a little bit. That said, I do think we're now at the phase in the AI adoption cycle where a lot of people are starting to think, well, actually what we built sort of doesn't work very well, or it wasn't the silver bullet that we hoped it would be. So I don't think it would be difficult to persuade people that this is important. But as designers, I think it's where we can really help. So that was it was very quickly written though, so it's probably got typos and all sorts. I wrote it all by hand, didn't use AI at all. So
nice. Yeah, I think it's there's an interesting element to what you're describing of the output of the work and the sort of human versus AI aspect of that, but also the process that you go through to get to that output. And I do think something we believe is in the importance of craft being central to how AI integrates into ways of working, because I think there are ways that craft might not necessarily be associated with the final details and polish of that final output, but is a mindset and a way of iterating, refining, honing what your internal ways of working are to get to a consistently reliable output. And so I think there's I don't want to get craft just associated with, and I think in the current conversation about AI and quality, I think craft has been heavily anchored in that final, what customers see, what those final details are. And I think that's part of it, but I think there is something deeper there as well about you can't just have people focusing only on the final output and expect it to be high craft, because the output is there without having incorporating craft into the practice of building products for your organization. And yeah, I think the barbell is also interesting with the sort of setting direction at the start and then coming in and evaluating quality, which I think are obviously the highest leverage human aspects of the process right now. But I think there is potentially a risk of giving away too much of the middle, that the craft at both ends of the spectrum atrophies a little bit, because there's less of a connection between like what are the materials we're actually working with and how do we get the most out of them in this specific format. So yeah, that's maybe a slightly separate piece to your article, but the sort of material you're working with is interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think your point around the atrophy, I think it's probably fairly pernicious and slow to spot at first, and hard in any given moment to justify the cost of doing it when AI could just do this. Like AI could just do this really quickly, so why am I doing it? And I think I sort of said I wrote this by hand, but writing is thinking for me, and I find it really hard to give AI any part of writing really beyond a copy edit, or does this make sense? Does it fit together? Are the paragraphs in the right order? Like that's the sort of level that I'm comfortable with AI writing for me. Writing, there's craft in writing, of course, as well. And I would never claim to be a great writer. In fact, I would probably say I write worse than the AI could write what I've written, but it's mine, so I want it for myself. And I think what you see with when people overuse this stuff is there's too much of it for a start, but there's also a sort of genericism about it. And you can see it when you ask Claude to write an article for you with around these 3 bullet points. It's like anyone could have written that. There's no opinion there, and it's the same with design. It's like good and convincing until you realize that it looks the same as everyone else's and it doesn't say really anything about you. So making it worse is like a weird thing to advocate for, but craft can sometimes feel like worse but different, and getting worse and then coming back in a different way that's more powerful or more unique or says more about you, I think is that's the work really, isn't it? There's no shortcutting that. So
yeah, and I think there's a subtle distinction there between, is the thing you care about the one-off output, or is the thing you care about building the muscle of getting better at that for the 10th version of that thing that you're producing? And in your case with writing, yes, AI might be able to help you get a more coherent V1, but if the thing you really care about is strengthening your critical reasoning of that idea or the thinking in that space, then by article 10, your opinions are going to be so much stronger from having gone through the manual labor of thinking through it and writing things out. So yeah, it's sort of a balancing act. And I guess that varies also by the individual and what their strengths are and where they want to focus. And there's a whole category of things that are completely valid to outsource to AI or get AI to support with. But I think being really clear on how you want to use it and where it fits into your world. And I think a craft mindset is a good one to channel that energy to the right place. I think can really help you get the most out of like the value there.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I feel like this has turned into like the broadest possible conversation about AI and design, but that's okay. Maybe they all just there's an inevitability to it that it's such a big conversation to have, and it really is all the conversation, and it's what this podcast is about. So we're always going to end up sort of descending into broadness.
Yeah. We should definitely move on. But I think the last thing I want to say on this is we've used the word design a lot. We have consciously tried to use the word design a little bit less in the sort of broader work we've been doing, and instead focusing more on the idea of craft, because I think in many organizations, design is closely connected with the idea of craft and making sure the quality of the work that ships is to a high standard. But I think there's definitely, you mentioned writing craft, there's the sort of craft of people management, there's the craft of being a great PM or a great user researcher. And so if you're listening to this, sometimes we'll say design, but we're sort of more generally focusing on that sort of craft outcome through any discipline that touches a product which reaches a customer at some point.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my final thought on there. Let's switch gears and sort of lighten the mood a bit. I wanted to talk about this last weekend. I went on a camping trip with some friends. The weekend where it was unbearably hot, but fortunately, it wasn't actually as hot on the campsite. But there's this talk of craft and AI kind of got me thinking about like ownership in this era. Is that even relevant? What does it mean? But my friend went on this camping trip and he bought an MP3 player, the only MP3 player that Argos in the UK sells. It was £20, and he, my friend Sam, I loved him for his dedication to owning music and owning MP3s, but just hearing his stories of how hard it was to get MP3s onto this iPod, or not, it wasn't an iPod, it was an MP3 player, and just how clunky the experience was, took me out of my bubble a bit and made me realize how imagining a world without Spotify or Apple Music or these streaming music services is just increasingly difficult to imagine. And ownership is a sort of strange concept in this current era, but it was also sort of really inspiring to see my friend sort of wrestle with this MP3 player to try and make a playlist and make it like compelling, and he had to bring his laptop and sync it with the MP3 player. Anyway, it was a funny thing to think about music ownership right now, and the idea of an MP3 being old school technology at this point, even though it's probably still the standard of how music would be shared if it wasn't for streaming services.
Right.
But streaming services are so ubiquitous now.
So is he paying 99p for a song on iTunes? Like, what's the practically?
I don't know whether he's using iTunes or not, but he did specifically say he was buying music, supporting artists. He's a musician himself, so lots of respect for supporting artists and buying their MP3s, but just it's hard going. Another friend of mine hosted a record party on Friday, which I couldn't go because I was at the camping trip. But the sort of concept of this party was to bring your own record and so everyone at the party could play their record and tell the story of what it meant to them, which I love that as a concept. It feels extremely
middle class millennial.
I imagine that was a core demographic. But the sort of the narrative around music ownership and the sort of stories associated with that, I think, is.
I love it.
Very, very interesting.
I just struggle to choose one. I wouldn't know. How do you choose one? Impossible.
Yeah. Well, do you own many records, Jonny?
About 3 or 4 yards, as I think record people say.
Okay.
So not a big collection, but I pick things that it's like a subset of what I listen to, but it's things that I feel like I would like to put on and sit and listen to And I buy it if it's a good album. I'll buy it if it's a good shape of a sort of album. If I think that the album tells a story, because when you put, as you'll know, when you put a record on, you have to actively listen to it, because you have to flip it halfway, and like, you know, the number of times I put a record on and then come back an hour later and it's just like on the end bit. I'm like, oh, I forgot I put that on. But yeah, I'm a part-time collector. How about you?
Amazing. I own maybe 1 yard of records, physical records, so not the same 4 yards as you. I think it'd probably be an easier choice for me to decide what record to bring, but yeah, there is something very very rich and interesting about the sort of physicality of the material, like the idea that you're holding the music that you can then play.
Yeah.
Anyway, we don't need to go on a huge digression on this, but I think as we get deeper into the themes of craft and AI, we haven't yet talked about any impact to musical artists or other sort of art forms in general. And I'm curious if that will come up naturally in time, but this is a small sort of glimpse of one small aspect of this corner of the creation of art and what that could look like in these forms. Anyway, that's way deeper than I was expecting that to go. Final quick thought I want to share before we jump into some news is watching the World Cup. It's been super fun. I've used this Claude Code Work. This isn't really a calendar hack. It's just one prompt. But I asked Claude Code Work to add all of the games to my calendar, obviously in the correct time zone, and then write in the TV station that is streaming them. And it's been incredibly useful as a way of just looking at my calendar and seeing, oh, this game is being streamed on this channel at this time. I also had it add the flags to the teams, so I could just quickly scan my calendar and see what games have been. I haven't been watching many of them actually because of the time zone difference, and most of them are in the middle of the night. But it's been a very surprisingly useful single prompt. Have you used any hacks around the World Cup?
That is so clever, and I've not done anything. I feel like a dinosaur. I go to bed, and then in the morning I wake up and I watch the 8-minute BBC highlights, and then when England are on, I Google to see what channel I should turn on, and that's about it. That's, you know, I am as basic as they come, probably. Wow, you brought AI to work this morning. I was like, I need a haircut. And I just genuinely got annoyed that I couldn't ask Claude to give me a haircut. So I'm, I don't know. I have a strange relationship maybe with Claude at the moment. Let's move on to some news. I've got a couple of things that I just spotted. One interesting and one silly, or not silly, but cool and just like a beautiful piece of work. So Fable, Anthropic announced that Fable's back. Fable's coming back tomorrow. Sonnet 5 is out today, I think, so it'll be interesting to see the reception that gets. So these state-of-the-art frontier models are still advancing, and it's good to see Fable coming back. There was a sort of vague, obscure post about good conversations with government and a few more guards being put in place around cybersecurity and things like that. So I don't think it undoes any of the damage that was done when Fable was taken away. I think all of the alarm bells rung around sovereign AI and being beholden to the US are still ringing. I think there's a lot of work going on in the background, especially with non-US domiciled companies and people, to try and work out how to mitigate for the risk. One of which I think is really interesting and seems to have blown up over the last week, which is Z.ai, which is I think a Hong Kong, maybe Shanghai-based lab. They build this model GLM, and GLM 5.2, which is an open weights model, is out, and everyone's raving about it and how good it is at coding and some of the things that people have so far relied on these frontier models to do. And so there is like a healthy narrative now, which is like, oh, maybe the open source models can keep up, and maybe they can even close the gap on the state of the art, and maybe a lot of the work we need to do doesn't need to be done by a state-of-the-art model. So we can use, the Fables to do the really hard stuff, and then these open source models where we can host them anywhere, and a 60th of the cost, the token cost, can do the grunt work around writing code. So interesting. We won't go any more into it right now, but definitely tracking it. And I think that it's good news for the rest of the world, I suppose, that Fable's back and the open source models are good. It's still a Chinese model. So, I think Europe and the middle powers need to work out how to have their own frontier or near frontier models, but it's good in the meantime. The other one that I found, and I will share my screen for this because I think it's cool and I think people need to see it, and hopefully I'll remember to actually switch to the view which shows the video this time, which I didn't do last week. But let me just share my screen for shortcuts. It's shortcuts, but spelt with no vowels. So here you will see it. It's, I think, just an example of a tool. It's built by a design studio, branding studio actually. And all it does, if you're listening, is it's got a list down the side of all of the different design tools basically, and coding tools. And you can click one, and then it drills down into it, and you hover over the different shortcuts. So for example, I'm in Figma and I've got pen tool, which is P, and you hover over it, and then this beautiful keyboard just like animates. If I just refresh this, it like animates in, and then you can click Photoshop and like scroll up and down and it highlights the keys. Really simple. This is just one of those examples of the kind of tool that you can just build now. Obviously, this took taste and it took time and it was work for sure. But, this may have been someone who previously wouldn't have been able to have brought any of this stuff to life. It feels genuinely useful, but it's also just like a nice piece of art. So I'll put that in the show notes as well, in beautiful designy things that now exist that didn't previously. And this is quite a good transition into our workshop. So
yes, shall I tell the listeners about our workshop?
Yeah, you do it, Tom.
So I think we hinted at this last week. We are launching our first open workshop, and by open that means it's open to any individual who would like to join us to build a design tool together. And we're going to do this online on August 13th. It's going to be a half-day session. There's more information about this at a URL, which is probably going to be nearfuture.works/build. If it's not, we'll add it in the show notes, or we'll edit this out probably. But hopefully that's the URL. And just before we start recording today for the podcast, we tried to record a 30-second clip explaining what the workshop is about. And so we thought we'd share some behind the scenes thoughts on that, although aware we're coming up on time, so we should probably keep this brief. But it was super fun to write a short script and try and sound compelling, although I think in a lot of ways it sounds like an infomercial. So if you listen to it, please listen to it, check it out, and bear with the awkwardness of us sounding like an infomercial, and stay for the part where Jonny lists out all of the design tools we've recently seen. Not all of them, some of them, because it's impressive that you managed to get through that whole list without breaking.
Well, I thought I was going to be able to do it in one breath, but it took 2 breaths. I was a bit disappointed about that. But yeah, we need auto cues, because reading from a script is surprisingly hard, I think, when you're also trying to look compelling and look like you're looking at the camera. Yeah, it ended up as 2 minutes as well. We were aiming for 30 seconds. It ended up as 2 minutes. But I think 2 minutes is pretty good. So I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much about that. But yes, do check it out. And also do check out the actual workshop, because we'll be building design tools. Maybe design tools like shortcuts, maybe tools that do all sorts of different things. And we've run this before. It's really fun. Genuinely like fun and fast moving. It's not watching us talk all the time. We get hands on really quickly, and everyone will walk away with something that they've built and something they could take back to their team and things like that. So that's on the 13th of August, and it's going to be online, and it's going to be half a day, and tickets will be live soon. I think that's it really, hopefully. Tom, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that is it. Hopefully we'll be live tomorrow with both the podcast and that website. so that you can sign up for. And this is especially suited. You can bring others in your team along with you, or you can just come solo. We have found a lot of companies we've spoken to have small design teams. Maybe there's 2 or 3 designers there, and people are curious to dig into this, but it's sort of hard to justify doing a whole team session when the team is small. So if you're a solo person out there, or you're in a small team, or even if you're in a big team but your company is not doing as much as you would like to do in exploring this AI space, then this really is for you. So hopefully you'll check it out and at least consider it. And if not, then well, if you do check it out and decide not to do it, then we'd love to hear any feedback or thoughts you have, both for that, but also for the podcast in general. We have been getting some good feedback so far. It's been really helpful in us shaping our format, the stuff we're talking about, and potential future guests that we're going to be inviting on. So please, if you have any ideas, if you listen to this, have some thoughts you want to share, email us. We have an email address, in fact, that Jonny set up. I think it is podcast@nearfuture.works. So drop us a note there, or ping either of us individually. We'd love to hear it.
It's okay to just tell me to brush my hair and stop wriggling around so much. That's acceptable feedback.
Excellent.
Right, let's call it.
Great.
One in the can. Thanks everyone for listening, and see you next week.
Thank you.